I'm going to read this morning from Hebrews 3. And the reason I'm reading from Hebrews 3 is because God's been taking me on a little bit of a journey over the past few weeks. And I thought I'd let you share in my pain. Because it's been quite hard, actually, to journey this and hear from God. And I went on holiday a few weeks ago. And that definitely wasn't the painful bit. That was the really nice bit where I got to lay in the sun and try and hear from God. And before I went away, we had a meeting about future. As you know, things are changing. Andy and Sam are transitioning into their new roles. And we had a meeting about, like, what does that look like for me? What does my future look like? And it wasn't a bad meeting, it was a good meeting. But I went away to pray and think about what the future looked like and what a better environment to do it in. As I left Andy at the pool and I walked down and discovered this beach bar that was incredible. And I think it was 11:30 on a Sunday morning with a beer at the beach bar, hearing from God. But you're on holiday, so any time is okay. That was later than some mornings. And God did speak to me, and he spoke to me as I lay on the beach and the waves were coming in, and he spoke to me as I was on a quad going through the desert, just whispers of God speaking, and it was incredible because so often life gets really busy. And I try my best to carve out time to hear from God and to read my Bible. I try my best to do that, but sometimes it's getting away from everything and really resting and really hearing from God. But do you ever have those moments where you've heard from God and yet you still go, was it definitely you, God? Is that definitely what I heard? Did I hear right? And you get a bit nervous about what you feel God was saying. And you also get nervous that actually, I know God's got the best for me, but actually I know it's not always easy. And I know that it's never plain sailing. There's always challenges in the new thing and in the next thing. And so you begin to depend on yourself again and go, God, I know I've seen your faithfulness. I know that you've got the best for me, but I just want to hold on a little bit longer because I feel like I know better. And I found myself in that place a little bit as I was away. And I began to remember and retrace the steps of my life and see God's goodness and see God's faithfulness throughout. And so I'll explain a bit more why I'm reading from Hebrews 3, verse 4 to 19. It says, "For every house is built by someone, but God is a builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, bearing witness to what would be spoken by God in the future. But Christ is faithful as the son over God's house. And we are his house, if indeed we hold firmly to our confidence and the hope in which we glory." So as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear my voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. During the time of testing in the wilderness where your ancestors tested and tried me, though for 40 years they saw what I did. That is why I was angry with that generation. I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared an oath in my anger. They shall never enter my rest. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but encourage one another daily, as long as it is called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. We have come to share in Christ, if indeed we hold our original conviction firmly to the very end. As has just been said, today, if you hear my voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. Whilst I was away and praying, I found myself recalling God's faithfulness and actually in awe of what he'd done. Like when I look back over my life and I saw his goodness in the moments of my life, when I saw his plan working out when I could never have worked it out. I was thinking back to when I first joined the message and all that stuff that's happened over the years. And I was going over the moments that I'd felt God speak. And I'd gone away with a notebook, and one notebook was my God notebook and the other notebook was my work notebook. Both of them came out with me every day, and if I had work brain on, I would write in my notebook to get rid of my work brain, and the other book was I tried to keep for God. And I really wanted to hear from God every day. That was the plan. I was like, God, I really just want you to speak to me every day. So I'd start the day writing day 1, day 2, in the hope that I would be writing something underneath it. And every day God spoke, even if it was in a small way. None of it was massive dramatic stuff. It was all just God's whispers, God's reminders. Do you remember that word of prophecy? Do you remember what that person spoke over you? Do you remember when I was with you in your pain? Do you remember when I provided for you? Do you remember how you walked with me in forgiveness? Do you remember me? Do you remember my faithfulness? Then the day before we came home, I sat again and again. I went back to my little book and I started to look back over the days and remember again what God had been saying over those days. And again, I started to go, not heard, like it's not been a big dramatic thing. Like I know God's spoken to me and that's great. It's not been a big dramatic thing. And then a little sparrow landed on the bottom of my leg as I lay on the bed, on the sunbed thing. And I'd just had a bacon butty. My little morning, too late for breakfast, so go at the last minute and grab a bacon butty and take it to the pool. That was my little morning thing some mornings. And this sparrow landed on my ankle. And so I got a piece of the bread and I put it on my knee and the sparrow just walked up to my knee and took the bread. It was like so close and I felt God say to me, I even care about the sparrows. Look to me and the details of your life will be dealt with. And here we are in Hebrews, where we hear about God being above it all. Moses is big up. Moses was a great servant of God. A faithful man who served God. But Christ is faithful over all. God who owns the house, God who chooses to live in us, who chooses to make his home in us. Recall his faithfulness. Let's recall the things that he's done. God who knows the biggest picture. God who knows exactly what we need. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden our hearts. God who has a great plan for our life, even when we mess up and we make those stupid choices. Sometimes when you bring up kids and you see them making silly choices and you think, God must be flipping so frustrated sometimes with some of the choices we make. And when we think we know better, and it's like, I bet he's like, having a laugh. And he uses in this chapter, they use the time of Israel's failures to trust God, which resulted in them wandering in the desert for 40 years. And in Numbers 14, verse 22 to 24, it says this: the Lord replied, I have forgiven you as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. Not one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. See, this was the people who knew about God's faithfulness. But when they came to the border of the promised land, they got scared. Like they knew God's faithfulness. They could recall God's faithfulness. But they saw the giants before they saw what God could do. And I wonder whether they stopped for a moment. I wonder whether they shared stories as they discussed whether they could go into the land. I wonder if they looked back and remembered stories of crossing the Red Sea. I wonder if they said to each other, do you remember? Do you remember stood at the Red Sea when we thought we were going to die? Do you remember when Moses lifted his staff and we were like, what the heck do you think you're doing, Moses? That's going to do nothing. I wonder whether they began to recall stories, remembering what God had done. But that was then, and this was today. And verse 15 of Hebrews 3 says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion. We can't live off the yeses of yesterday. Like, I can tell you of so many yeses that were hard, but they're done now. It's time for the yes of today, and God's been challenging me over that. These people who knew God's faithfulness got to the land of Canaan. They saw how incredible it was, flowing with milk and honey, an amazing place. But they saw the giants, and they weren't willing to face the challenges that came with it. As a result, God disciplined them. As a result, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. That, for me, is such a scary thought. Today, if we hear his voice, do not harden our hearts. And we're not talking about, today, if you hear his voice, don't harden your hearts because you won't get into heaven. We can continue in life loving Jesus, but not in the fullness of the life that he's offering us as individuals. Maybe not living there because of doubting ourselves, or not living there because of fear, or not living there because we're going to miss what was as we go into the next season. Not living there because we're choosing comfort over him. We're at risk of staying in that place of what becomes a hardened heart, not necessarily a bad heart, just a heart that isn't fully given over to him. A heart that isn't convinced of his faithfulness to us, his faithfulness in his plan. I know I'm sharing this morning because I felt God wanted me to share it, because actually I felt like I was in that place where I was in danger of going for comfort, in danger of going, I don't know if I fully trust you, God, for the future. Like I think I might know the best. And I had to go back and I had to remember his faithfulness again. I didn't have a hardened heart against God or a hardened heart against his plans. In fact, if anything, my heart was desperate to get it right and scared of getting it wrong. Heart that maybe grieved the old season, because you all know change is hard. And I needed a reminder. And then last week I came back from my holiday. And I came back and we had another meeting about future. And again, it was a good meeting. It was nothing bad in it. There's nothing bad in the future stuff. It's good. And I went home and I went to bed. And I woke up at 3 a.m. and absolutely flooded with tears. Like, it's not happened to me for years. It used to happen to me on a regular basis in the early days of grieving, and I'd wake up and my pillow was soaking, and I woke up in this state, like 3 a.m. And I was like, what the heck is this? Like, I know, like, things are slightly scary as things change, but like I'm not like this. It felt like a heavy weight of grief, and I was like, it didn't stop. The tears flowed. Andy was asleep next to me. And I'm like, try not to wake him. I wasn't like crying out loud or anything. I'm not a loud crier, just so you know. And I was just silently, tears just wouldn't stop flowing. And after 2 hours, like, of thinking, like, what the heck is this? Like, you know, at night when you have those feelings, and they're always worse when it's the middle of the night. I don't know if you're the same, but I wake up and if I'm worried about something, it's always a lot worse in the middle of the night. It was that feeling, but intense. And after about 2 hours, I was like, God, like, it took me 2 hours to pray. No, I'd prayed in between, but after about 2 hours, I was like, God, what is this? Like, I don't know if, because this is so abnormal, I don't know if you're trying to speak to me. And so I said, but right now, I've got to get up for work in 2 hours. And I need to sleep. So God, if you're speaking to me, would you let me sleep? And maybe would you even give me a dream? And I never normally pray that. Maybe you just give me a dream and just show me what you're saying. Lost my place now. And I woke 2 hours later when my alarm went off, having had one of the most vivid dreams I've ever had. And I was stood at a well in a village, and I was handing buckets to the people in the village, and they were drinking the buckets, and they were like going, like it was like liquid gold going inside them. And as I pulled the next bucket out, I looked inside the bucket and there was nothing in there. So I said to the next person, what is in the bucket? And they said, this is hope. You're giving me hope. And I drove to work that morning, and I felt God speak to me again, and he said, how much do you trust me to protect what you're scared of losing? Remember my faithfulness, remember my goodness, and don't harden your heart over fear. See, the grief you felt last night was a grief that started with a natural fear. But imagine how much more I grieve for my people. I'm turning that grief into a deeper level of grief for my people. That's the grief you experienced. Are you willing to trust me with your fears, knowing I've been faithful in the past? And are you willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of my people? Are you willing to be uncomfortable for the sake of my plan? And I was a mess. It hit me like a brick because I was suddenly like, God, I cared more about my discomfort. And I didn't even realize I was doing it. And I got to work and I opened my daily reading in the office. And it was Hebrews 3. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. I've not heard God speak in such a way in a long, long time. Remember his faithfulness. Recall his goodness. And when we hear his voice, the voice that guides us, the voice that comforts us, his voice that brings peace, his voice that speaks truth, whether it's because of a decision you're making for the future or whether it's that something that you need to take on, that peace of God that he's offered us, don't ignore it. Don't grab hold of fear and not take what he's offering. The promised land, the promise of peace, the promise of freedom, the promise of comfort, the promise of salvation, and the promise of his plan for our lives. God, Christ, who's faithful. Let's today remember his faithfulness and take on his promises for our lives. Let me pray. God, we thank you once again for your faithfulness. God, I am blown away by your goodness. Cannot even begin to put it into words. But God, I'm in awe of you and the way you work out your plans. And God, this morning, we give you permission to work out your plans. God, this morning we take on that which you offer. We don't hear about the peace you offer and choose fear, but we take it on. We step into what you're calling us into, the promised land of goodness, the promised land of faithfulness, the promised land of your peace. Amen.
You've been watching Message Live.
And we hope it's been a great encouragement to you.
Would you subscribe to our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook?
And ring that bell for notifications.
And thanks for watching.